Welcome, everyone, to the Deloitte and Dragos webcast titled Future of Cyber. My name is Robert Lee, and I'm one of your speakers today. We also have Sean on the line from Deloitte. So this webinar really came out of the discussion of what is the executive level view of cyber, and specifically, what are some of those initiatives and things that are happening as it relates to operational technology, specifically industrial control systems, over this next year. So for myself, my name is Rob Lee. I'm the CEO and founder of Dragos. My background has largely been on the threat component of the industrial control environments. So looking at and responding to a number of the various attacks that have happened in our space. Over the past couple of years and leading Dragos, though, now that I've got my team that's actually going out and do those things, I get relegated more and more to the role of being in high-level meetings. I try to get out and be a practitioner still, but my folks are smart enough to keep me out of that. So more and more I'm getting brought into those executive level discussions. And over the past year, ended up having around a dozen different board meetings where I was a guest, talking to various energy and manufacturing companies on what the cyber component of the risk is, especially for those industrial environments. And so that's where I'll be taking the webcast today from my vantage point. And then Sean, how about you introduce yourself and talk about where you'll be discussing your portion of the webcast.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody to today's webcast, where we're going to talk about our future of cyber and where we need to be thinking about for the future. So my name is Sean Peasley. I'm a partner in our cyber risk practice. Helped start the practice almost 26 years ago, and back then really focused on the enterprise. And over the last 10 years or so, we've really shifted to look at those issues that are really going to affect all of society and organizations as we look at just the changes of technologies and innovation and things of that nature. So we are going to speak about that today. I lead our IoT security practice for the US and globally, and much of the discussion today is going to focus more on IoT and operational technologies. So Deloitte Cyber set out to gain insights into how leaders are embracing the concepts of cyber everywhere, how they're operating in the new reality, how they're collaborating with partners and other stakeholders. The 2019 Future of Cyber Survey highlights the disconnect between what organizations aspire versus the current reality of their cyber posture. I'll share just a few of the telling findings with you this morning. So today's organizational leaders are focused on digital transformation as a catalyst for change, but haven't necessarily adjusted their go-to market strategy to reflect a cyber-first approach to adopting and implementing those concepts. With acknowledgement that cyber is everywhere comes the need for organizational leadership to get real about how they intend to manage the pervasiveness of cyber in the new era of cloud, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and data integrity. So if we could go to the next slide, please. With our survey respondents, it indicates that their organizations are not prioritizing one transformation effort over another, but taking them all at once. And as part of the survey, we spoke to over 500 organizations, combinations of chief risk officers, chief security officers, chief information security officers, and chief information officers, and really got a very, view of how they're viewing where they're at and what they need to look at for the future. So they're focused on transformations. And the first thing we learned is that organizations are taking on digital transformations, cloud, cognitive, IoT, AI, which they're taking on at the same time. So this would be daunting for any organization, but more alarming is the question, are these organizations factoring in cyber as part of the adoption strategy for AI, for IoT, cloud, blockchain, and beyond? And our survey results tell us not really. The survey results tell us that the perception may actually be leading reality when it comes to cyber organizations' ability to keep pace with transformation and in leading enterprise adoption of cybersecure culture. So this is based on a few key findings as we looked at the results of the overall survey. So the respondents view cyber transformation as one of the most challenging aspects of cyber risk management that are related to the entire infrastructure, so 32%. And with the chief security officers, 35%, and chief information officers, 34%, ranking cyber transformation as the most challenging. So as we look at this, it's going to be imperative for those organizations to determine, how do they invest in their cyber transformations as there's a lot going on in their organizations. So this may be the most informative data point of the survey, as CISOs and CIOs are putting a spotlight on challenges ahead. So with those finite budgets, the finite resources, the ability to apply the level of cyber strategic input and security measures needed, as well as to deliver on the day-to-day cyber management, will likely tax even the highest performing cyber team. So as the survey findings were further reveal, the challenges will not be limited to budget and resources, but to a collective enterprise alignment on integrating cyber into critical business strategy and operations, including things like culture. If you look at where they need to look at for the future, how do they build security into the products that they may develop, or build it into a factory that they're trying to do a tech refresh. Cyber needs to be part of all of those discussions throughout the organization. So if we could move to the next slide, please. First, survey respondents told us that their cyber budgets are spread equally across the cyber domains of data, infrastructure, identity, application, incident response, technical resilience, and threat detection, with just under 15% of the total budget spent on transformation efforts at large. We all recognize that organizational undertakings for these transformation initiatives, as well as the need to prioritize and allocate funding for the security of these efforts. But do organizations feel the same way? When given an additional opportunity within the survey to write in whatever number best represents the percentage of the cyber budget allocated to digital transformation efforts, the answers again were telling, with the majority, 90%, surveyed citing 10% or less of budget dollars assigned for efforts such as cloud migration, software as a service, implementation, analytics, and machine learning. So this highlights a stark disconnect between aspirational transformation goals and the reality of finite resources. We all recognize the organizational undertakings for these transformation initiatives, as well as the need to prioritize and allocate funding for the security of these efforts. But do organizations feel the same way? So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. The survey reveals that respondents believe there are notable gaps in organizational capabilities to meet today's cybersecurity demands. Cyber teams are challenged by their ability to help organizations better prioritize cyber risk across the enterprise, so 15%, follow closely behind a lack of management alignment on priorities and lack of adequate funding at 13%. The results also show a lack of skilled cyber professionals needed to address those priorities and the governance across the organization for it all. And really trying to acquire and really retain those cyber professionals is a key challenge that organizations are facing today. Often there's lack of ability to prioritize risk because executive teams haven't locked into a framework or a governance model. Therefore, leaders have a hard time determining how to focus remediation efforts necessary to mitigate the cyber risk to the organization. There are several different frameworks that exist to help an organization manage and report on its cyber risk posture with differing criteria and risk levels. In order to effectively manage cyber risk, there also needs to be a stronger correlation between technical vulnerabilities, business impacts, and the values to the organization. So as we move to the next slide, from the results illustrated, we see that nearly half of organizations, or 49%, have cybersecurity on their board agenda, at least quarterly. However, at some level, it can be viewed that half of boards are not discussing cyber as often as they likely should be. After all, only 4% of respondents say cybersecurity is on the agenda once a month. With the level of risk associated with cyber, typically one of the top risks that organizations are facing these days, shouldn't it have some level of consideration at every board meeting? Kind of like 10, 15 years ago when we had to start talking about internal controls related to Sarbanes-Oxley. I think we need to look at cyber as a key risk that boards need to be addressing very frequently. So today's boards should have adequate access to cybersecurity expertise and discussion about cyber risk management. That should be given regular, adequate time on the board meeting agenda. So a skew in these results is the CISO perception of cyber on the board agenda. 77% of CISOs reported that this occurred quarterly, where the other C-suite leaders surveyed indicated much lower percentages. We feel that this data supports the fact that CISO may not actually have line of sight to executive management and the board, whereas most of the other roles surveys do. So Rob will tell us more about the board role coming up from the Dragos board report. In most cases, the CISO is the de facto cyber champion of the enterprise. Over the course of 5 to 10 years, we have observed the role expanding beyond that of a technology champion to one of a strategist and advisor to executive management. But in our experience, here's what classically happens. Cyber is stuck in IT, and IT reports to the CIO. The cyber budget is nested under the IT budget, which is why we often see that cyber isn't actually prioritized or resourced. In many cases, this leads to situations where the CISO lacks the ability to shape strategy, help organizations prioritize cyber effectively. So it should be seen that a necessary element of the investments made to achieve strategic goals of the enterprise. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So much of what is being written about the future of cyber is addressing the looming cyber talent gap. Organizations today are already stressed to see staff appropriately, and the cyber workforce is struggling to keep up with the demand. By 2021, there's an estimated astounding 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity positions worldwide. That means cybersecurity professionals will have to find ways to compensate for those empty slots. There's too many facets to consider, too many vulnerabilities to take note of, and too few IT professionals to manage every threat. According to our survey, 85% of the participants indicated that some level of reliance on vendors and managed service providers to provide cybersecurity operations, with 66% of those outsourcing between 21% and 50% of cyber operations, and 14% of total respondents indicating that more than 50% of their cyber operations are outsourced. So we can get an idea from the survey results that organizations are already demonstrating the willingness to rely on third parties to help address cyber everywhere. When looking across the roles of the survey respondents, 65% of CISOs put that percentage of outsourced cyber operations in the 21 to 30% range. The consistency of the CISO responses with the differences in comparison to the other C-suite leaders surveyed helped us to infer that the CISO is typically responsible for the day-to-day cyber oversight. So as we move to the next slide, it takes a village to create the cyber team. So part of the challenge for organizations evolving their cyber risk capability is that many are limiting themselves by trying to build other cyber capabilities in-house. So resources are hard to train and harder to retain. If organizations are going to prioritize cyber in the organization, then executive leadership should begin to explore talent models and strategies to keep up with the burgeoning resource demands. Contractors or outsourcing entire capabilities are more efficient and often can deliver at higher service level. Considerations should also be given to automation of processes and services, which can help improve speed, quality, and help the organizations to do more with less. Survey respondents indicated a willingness to outsource a myriad of cybersecurity functions. So worth noting, 50% of CIOs most often selected security operations, and 48% of CISOs chose insider threat detection. So both of those selections stood out in the response data specific to the roles surveyed. But across the board, our survey respondents indicated that they turn to partners most often when it comes to security operations vulnerability management, physical security, and training and awareness. So as we go to the next slide, when it comes to cyber preparedness, constant change is often the most difficult to manage in any organization, and this provides the greatest advantage to the adversary. So by 2021, cybercrime damage is estimated to hit $6 trillion annually. To put that in perspective, that's almost 10% of the world's economy. Because the threat landscape changes rapidly and responses cannot be perfectly scripted, cyber wargaming has become a leading strategy to get ahead. Despite the benefits of cyber wargaming, our survey indicated that only about a third of the participating C-level executives say their companies conduct cyber wargaming exercises to prepare them for real-world incidents. As we move to the next slide, so as we strategize, for resilience, we need to have methods for testing cyber incident response processes and procedures. So we see, only 28% of CISOs participate in cyber wargaming. So that really needs to increase to really have those simulations to understand how do we respond in those situations. As we move to the next slide. So new executives and stakeholders, they need to be educated. There's new vernacular needed. We need to talk about, not just the typical enterprise or IT and the tech infrastructure, but we need to focus on things around, Internet of Things and operational technologies. So those are the growing footprints of the platforms for manufacturing, for operating the business, right? And that's going to be critical for executives to understand. The risk has shifted. It's not just the risk of financial data or personally identifiable data, but this is the crown jewels for an organization. Their operational, wherewithal is really required to have cyber risk appropriately managed there. So we need to align and enable innovation. We really need to think about, as organizations innovate for the future, coming up with new business opportunities. They really need to make sure they're considering cyber in those opportunities, whether it's a product that they're developing with connectivity and an IoT related product, or whether it's a new plant or a tech refresh. Cyber really needs to be part of those discussions as early as possible, having things like a secure by design, privacy by design philosophy, and really living that and building that into the culture. So it's not just a shift from IT to OT, but it's IT and OT and innovation. So our core IT focused business will help keep growing, but now we'll also grow OT at a scale well above the rates that we have in the past. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Very much appreciated. And I think that's a great transition point, especially as we start talking more of the board level topics that I experienced over the past year. The idea that IT and OT convergence, right? So we hear that, we've heard that for like a decade. IT and OT convergence has happened at the technical level already. Like that, we are already converged, and we're getting more because of that innovation discussion you had. But it's the people process, the governance of it, the understanding of the risk. That's where we're seeing more and more of that cultural convergence between IT and OT these days. And like you said, the innovation piece. I think there's a lot of security professionals out there that look at some of the innovation that's happening at the plant level and thinking, man, this is introducing a lot of new cyber risk. And they're right, but some of that is actually worth doing. I will recount the recent engagement where an asset owner was looking at offloading some of their historians, basically the brain down and what's going on at the ICS level, the memory, the understanding, like here's what the physical process is doing, temperature settings, valves, all the physical process getting recorded that historian is definitely one of your crown jewels of, if this gets compromised, that's a big deal for intellectual property as well as potential physical consequences if somebody were to use that to design an attack. And the discussion was, man, we can't let that get offloaded in the cloud. Which, as a security professional, my instant reaction was, yeah, don't do that. But then we looked at the business side of it, and they were getting value out of their plant and operate, sort of improving process such they could rebuild an entire new plant every 5 or 6 years. And so it's like, okay, you need compensating controls to do that. But the business is actually driving the way that it is for a reason. but we need to be thinking about how we can smartly do it. So, yeah, I think this is just a great transition and some of those things that everyone's struggling with now. If we go to the next slide. So for my view of things, like I said at the beginning, I take a very threat-centric approach. I think it's really telling and interesting to see where the CISOs and others are doing the surveys to understand the types of technologies and things that are at the forefront of their mind. I constantly hear things like AI and blockchain, and I think that in non-security fields, like they're going to find their use case for it. I think in the security field, the venture capital community is certain that there is a place. I think we're all just looking for it still on what exactly it's going to do for security. But the intelligence sort of approach is one that's a ground truth, ground level kind of approach. Not let's think about the latest DEF CON or Black Hat research and hey, what is this possible sort of scenario? All those things can be good to think about the hypotheticals of the world and what could happen. But hey, what is actually happening and what is introducing risk today and what do we need to be aware of today? That is more of that, again, intelligence approach of these things have occurred. If you are not well prepared for them and you're chasing the next generation of whatever, then that might be a bad thing. And that's really where the board level topic started as well. So I think back to Sean's point around a lot of boards are starting to ask more about cybersecurity. In the energy and manufacturing space, we're seeing that a lot more recently than ever before. I think electric utilities have had those conversations for a long, long time. But the larger energy space and the larger manufacturing space, we're seeing a ton of new interest at that board level. And there's rightfully a lot of confusion on, okay, what are we supposed to do? Again, the piece that sort of brought me in was the understanding of the different adversaries out there. And at Dragos, we track the specific ICS threats. So we don't look at every possible threat to an IT network, even if it is an energy company. We try to stay focused largely just so that we're good at what we do instead of trying to be good at everything. And we stay focused on the industrial component of it. So what are those threats? What are those groups and teams specifically targeting industrial networks, specifically going after safety, reliability, intellectual property, et cetera, at that level? In this past year, we released reports talking about the 8 different threats that we were publicly tracking that are pretty popular in this space. And then, of course, the lessons learned of what does that mean for where you take your security. We can all talk about quote unquote best practices, but in ICS security, a lot of the best practices have traditionally been copy and pasted from IT networks over into OT networks. And it's different systems with different missions, with different threats, and just copy and pasting things over isn't going to actually reduce your risk accurately. So figuring out what the tradecraft, what the methods or the MO or the profile of these threats are, what does it mean in terms of your risk, and trying to figure out what you should actually prioritize based off that is an important component. And it's a good foundational level discussion to lead into that more boardroom level talk. So if we go to the next slide. So like I said, I did about a dozen of these. I was an invited guest to brief on the cyber risk component to ICS, and specifically took that threat-based approach. But even though these companies were different sizes, different industries, different board makeup, some of them had a cybersecurity representative, some of them didn't. Some of them were very well connected with the government, some of them were not. They all generally had the same questions. So there's a couple outliers here and there, and I'll talk about those at the end as well. But by and large, these were the 3 questions that came up right out the start of the gate. And at each board level topic, these were the 3 that I saw. And so I figured, okay, maybe I'll capture my answers and do a paper and publish out to the industry. So at the end, we'll link to that. But I want to walk through these 3 questions and these answers that I gave, and then also elaborate them on a little bit for you in the audience and what that might mean for you. So when we look at the first question, it really just came down to, are we underspending or are we overspending, which is an entirely appropriate board level question. You want to be able to reduce risk, and you want to do whatever is required, especially for core topics like safety. But when you're talking about intellectual property, reliability, and business impact, you do need to have a discussion on what is the right call for the business. And that largely relates to return on investment. So are we spending enough and we're reducing good risk with it? Or now we're spending way too much and we're not really getting the return we used to, and maybe we need to look at different things. Maybe it goes back to more of the digital transformation instead of just the security aspect of it. So my answer right out the gate to most of these boards, honestly, was that they're probably underspending, and I expect that is the most vendor answer I could possibly give. But it's one of an understanding that most of these companies haven't really been doing a lot in the ICS security community before. So when I actually posed it to them to kind of help them answer their own question, I asked them to look and talk with the CISO or the CIO, whoever was in the room at the time, and get a decent understanding of where they're spending their security budget as just a percentage between IT and the stuff that's happening on OT, and specifically the ICS component of it. Where are they actually spending their budget? And when every single one of those discussions was a massive sort of lever over to the right of, hey, yeah, we're spending all the resources in IT. Upwards of 70, 80, 90% of the resources that we're spending are absolutely for IT security. And one of the things I posed to the board, which was not meant to be flippant, but just as a thought exercise in an extreme, was, look, there's obviously a lot going on in IT security, and you absolutely have to do this for a lot of reasons that impact the public, impact your stockholders. I mean, there's plenty of reasons that the IT security is important. Nobody's saying it's not. But could we agree that most of your revenue is being made on the operations technology side? And everybody in the board fully understood that. And so they fully understood that all of their money is getting made at the plant level, the control centers, the substations, et cetera. But all of their security resources are largely getting spent at the IT level. And historically, this was done not out of malice or ill content or incompetence. It was actually very smart, where getting into those operation technology environments was difficult historically. And even when it wasn't just purely difficult, it was the idea that, oh, well, our plants are connected up to our IT networks. If we detect things really well in our IT networks, we'll get it before it goes into our operation technology networks. So if we really can't get into the operation technology networks anyways, and it's difficult, there's cultural challenges, then let's spend money on the IT networks and just be really good at catching it early. That's obviously not a strategy that's been effective. It made sense, I think, originally, but the reality is our plants, our substations, our control networks, et cetera, are getting more and more connected than ever before. We're starting to see even sort of the cloud level discussions down to sensor and PLC and kind of control level directly. And then, of course, our integrators and our vendors and our maintenance folks, they've been coming in and out of those networks for a long time now, directly connected up. So I think it's fair to think, a lot of this may start in IT, but it's not fair to think that it's going to be your IT that it starts in. We're seeing more and more compromises at integrators and vendors and OEMs, and then them using that access that those folks have into your environments to pivot down into the operation technology environments. So largely, I would say that the folks out in the community are underspending, but it's also sometimes a misallocation of resources where we do a lot of things that we feel good about, but don't actually reduce risk. If you look at antivirus deployments in operation technology environments, almost universally, as an example, the antivirus is looking for things that don't associate with what we actually track as ICS threats. And even when they do, it's usually the case, actually predominantly the case, that your OEMs like Siemens, Honeywell, Emerson, whoever, all good vendors, but all of them require you to essentially exclude off the folders and file paths and processes running on the system as it relates to your actual HMIs and data storage and engineer workstations, et cetera. So in other words, you've got antivirus running in the box, but it's not actually looking at or scanning any of the stuff that actually is going to get impacted. So again, just to abstract it out to the board level topic, it's, yeah, we're probably underspending because we haven't been doing things a lot historically. And what we have been doing historically has been spending to put IT resources or IT security strategies onto the OT environment. And that's not going to be effective. So we need to actually think about a strategy and what the right investment is, and appreciate that a lot of our operation technology environments aren't just to the point where we can throw the existing IT resources at it, largely because the existing IT resources are already busy. Taking a team of 5 or 6 people that's trying to manage the enterprise and telling them that they now have responsibility over the industrial environment as well is not going to be a winning strategy, because those people are already busy. Next slide. So what's the best way to move forward? That's the very next question of, okay, Rob, we get it. We're probably underspending. How do we get started? What do we do? And I think on this topic, it really comes down really to sort of the assessment strategy and kind of tabletop view. I would expect that at a board level, we're thinking about what type of threats do we actually want to reduce risk to. Now, if you go and ask a board, what threat scenarios do you want to reduce risk to? They're not going to have a good answer. They're going to turn right back around, hopefully, and talk to the CSO or the CIO and say, look, why don't you figure out what our options are, and we'll help you prioritize them. And I think that is an appropriate answer. So I think what should happen is there should be that board level topic of security is important. Operation technology security is going to be different for us. Let's think through what we actually need to accomplish. Hey, I as the CISO or CIO, I'll go take that information and I'll come up with some options for you. And that's when we should look out in the industry of what threats are actually occurring and think through those threat scenarios that we want to be able to protect ourselves against. And we'll think about those things at a kind of a tactical level across prevention, detection, and response. So when we think about detection, prevention, and response, we need to ensure that the threats that we want to reduce risk against are actually well mapped out and thought through so that we can even have things like tabletop exercise off of them, because that's what we're going to come back to the board level with. So we're going to say, okay, here's the threat scenarios that we've come up with, maybe 5 or 6 key scenarios of what an attack against us might look like, what we would actually want to be able to do against it. But let's have a tabletop exercise now. Let's train against that to see just how that might work. Before we even get into the tech choices, before we get into assessments, before we get into actually buying anything, let's just think about the communication, who the process owners are, who the stakeholders are, who's a point of contact if a substation goes down. Like, what is the legal aspect of this? Do we have compliance like NERC-CIP in the electric industry that's going to dictate different responses? Let's think through the larger piece of this and sit down and exercise. Now, I think this also scratches the itch for a lot of boards where all the ones I talk to, but all the ones I see in general, really have a desire to help. And this is great, and I love boards for it. They definitely want to be more involved. But a board member really is coming in and out of the company every quarter or so, depending on your frequency. And yeah, your CEO is talking to them and using them as a sounding board, and boards are useful, but they're not there day to day to actually do the mission, and they shouldn't be. So expecting them to actually be heavily involved is generally not going to be a good strategy, but they still want to be involved. They still want to know that they are contributing, and they probably have a really important role to contribute, and have seen how other companies have gone down this path before. So at that point, I think it's really useful to probably sort of stack the deck in your favor. If you essentially maybe do an exercise, maybe do something like a threat hunt in your environment and say, okay, let's go do a service engagement. Let's look at our control environments. Let's look at our operation technology environment and determine, are we actually good against the kind of scenarios we're going to think about today? Because the board's immediately going to ask that afterwards anyways. Are we essentially well prepared to prevent, detect, and respond? And if not, where against this threat scenario? So kind of do that ahead of time anyways. And then maybe do an exercise, maybe do a tabletop exercise that includes operations technology and IT and technology first before you go up to the board level. And so I don't mean essentially just rehearse everything. Just pick a different threat scenario than the one you're going to do at the board, but make sure that you have gone through some sort of tabletop exercise together before. Then you want to bring it up to the board. Then you want to say, okay, let's now pick something in our industry that's real or has actually happened before. So if I'm in electric power industry, I'm probably going to pick the 2015 or 2016 Ukraine attacks. If I'm in manufacturing, I'm probably going to do something around ransomware and the various effects that we've been seeing lately. So I'm going to pick some topic that's real and tangible, and they've probably read stories or news media on before, and it's caused some concern. And now I'm going to go to do that tabletop exercise with them, and it's going to generate requirements. It's going to say, yeah, we don't have visibility into this network. We don't have detection capabilities over here. We actually haven't rolled out the firewalls yet to actually add any level of segmentation or view in our environment. You're going to run into the technical. You're going to run into the, oh yeah, we don't actually have a governance program for that. Or really, hey, yeah, the stakeholders are split across 3 different teams, and right now they don't even really meet up, and the bosses are different, so we don't really have a lot of good cohesion between those teams. you're going to run into tons of issues. It's completely normal, and it should be prepped ahead of time to the board that, yeah, this is to expose issues. Then off of that, you're going to be in a good place to actually not only have the board level view into this, but also generate role requirements. I think every security team on the planet not only does better with, but also sincerely desires real requirements. The, hey, go make us more secure is not a requirement, and it gets very, very difficult to measure against that. And then we get bad metrics, and then when there's morale issues, these things snowball very quickly. But with an understanding from the board level down of here's the types of scenarios we want to be well prepared against, and here's the resources it's going to take to get across people, process, and technology, now go do it. That's real requirements that can be measured. That's real view and that the board can be comfortable with, and it allows them to play that role. So the third and final question that came up, especially in the energy community, but it started coming up more and more in the manufacturing community as well, really boiled down to what's the role of the government? And this is a very natural question to occur because we've seen the government do a pretty fairly good job over the years of getting involved in the community and sending out representatives. And the representatives that come out don't typically go to the security person that's really running the show or doing the mission. A lot of times these FBI, DHS, kind of calls go direct to an exec or to a board level member. And so they're starting at the top of the organization anyways. So a lot of the executives are going, okay, well, what is their role? And I thought I was going to have a hard conversation with the boards on this of, look, there's a role, but believing that the U.S. government is just going to come in and do free incident response and know how to do your environment and actually just be able to take care of you and make this go away is not going to happen. I thought I might have to take that conversation, but actually the boards already fully understood that. And time again, they said, yeah, we fully expect that we own this risk. Like, so you can't outsource this to the government, but we still have a responsibility, especially if we're in critical infrastructure, to have some sort of discussion with the government. And what is that discussion? And so I thought that was a really good caging of the question, if you will. And my answer to them was, you're going to have points of contact with different government agencies. The reality is everybody wishes that there was one point of contact for the government. And if you talk to various government leaders, they'll echo that sentiment. But at the same time, the people that are actually coming out to our companies on a regular basis, they'll come from FBI, DOE, DHS, TSA, et cetera. And generally the message is always the same. Oh, just call me. And it's really good that we get these personal relationships setting up. And I'm really excited to see the government try to do more for our asset owners. But it's really noisy in the way that it gets accomplished. And so now as a board member or anybody on that executive staff is sitting there going, I've got like 15 phone numbers of people that I'm supposedly supposed to call. Who do I call and when do I call them? And again, my answer to that is establish a relationship. Your mileage may vary depending on the people that are actually working through your territory, if you will. And you may have a really good relationship with FBI and the Guard in the region. You may really have a good relationship with DOE. You may have a really good relationship with National Guard. You're going to have a really good relationship established with somebody. Have that as your main POC, but make sure you do have those phone numbers and your plans ready to call and talk to the different government entities. And this seems a little backwards for a lot of the security folks. I think a lot of the security folks I train and talk to sort of lament that a lot of times the government's not adding a lot of value, and now they're tasked with essentially updating government agencies about stuff that they don't even fully know the answer to right now. And it can actually be a burden instead of a help. And so my guidance on that is, look, I understand, but at an executive level, like, they still need to have that discussion. And if they go in front of, if your executives end up going in front of, your regulating entity like EPA or DOE or others, or end up going in front of Congress, hey, yeah, we decided not to talk to the government is not going to go very well. So there's this balancing authority. And many of the government teams do have additional insight and things to offer. Don't fall into the trap of, oh yeah, there's some classified data we can tell you. 9 times out of 10, there's not. I think the government and private sector have different views on what's valuable out of that data. The government will classify information related to attribution, But the private sector really just wants to know how the attack is occurring, and that data is not classified, and most times the government doesn't have it. So there's that balance there. But what I find especially useful, and what I've advised the asset owners on, which might seem a little bit backwards, but hang with me here, is don't call the government immediately. Now, if you have regulations or legal requirements, that's different. You do what you're supposed to do. But in the early days, when your security team's just trying to get their feet under them to understand what's going on, let them do that. Let them figure out the scope of the investigation. Let them start figuring out what the root cause analysis is, what's actually going on. Let them figure out just how far-reaching this might be, and kind of the type of threat that they're looking at. Is it random ransomware? Is it a targeted threat? Is it an insider? Let them figure out those components and keep the board up to date on what's going on, and then have a predefined trigger. So it should be in your incident response plan. It should be something that's rehearsed in that tabletop exercise. Have a predefined trigger that effectively, when you reach that point, you know that you're then going to hit up your different POCs, the different government agencies, and do it in written communication. And so this isn't meant to throw shade or any sort of aspersions against any entity, but time and time again, especially in the industrial infrastructure community, we have seen tons of leaks come out through government partners, and not all of them, but some of them, where I can think of at least a half a dozen cases of quote unquote cyber attacks against ICS that made it into national headlines with completely wrong information and really trounced that company's name for them doing the right thing and informing government partners, and getting telephone gamed around and eventually leaked. So my advice is, yeah, still work with your government partners, but do it when you actually know what's going on, so that you can control that communication, you can control that narrative, and then make sure that your discussions are done in written format. And this was always kind of the view in the military anyways, and what my background in the Air Force was, look, you're going to go through some complex challenges. Save the emails, right? Do it in email, save it, make sure that you have a little bit of a CYA for what's actually going on, because these are going to be complicated topics. And if there are any attacks of significant means, it also means that we're going to have a lot of felicity on these things, and the stakes are going to be different. You want to talk about a compromise into a game company, maybe just the gamers that are playing off that game company care, and the stockholders. If you want to talk about what's going on with an electric utility or a manufacturer, now the entire community cares. It might be an entire country worth of people that care. It might be an international view of, hey, an attack on a manufacturing plant and pharmaceutical networks is making it where we don't have certain vaccines showing up to different countries. Okay, now we need a different level of communication. So the ability for these things to escalate quite quickly is definitely there. So in closing on that question, I would again say it's really important to define the role, to have good POCs, and to make sure that we understand the scope of our own discussion before we actually go out to the community. So next slide. Cool. So these are my key recommendations for industrial organizations, especially out of what came out of those the paper that I wrote and the communications that we had. I would ensure that you're actually validating the investments are going for operation technology and ICS security, and not just a quote unquote security budget, and that you're doing it in a way that's actually reducing your risk, especially against your threat landscape. You should understand the difference of being in the pharmaceutical community versus the difference being in the electric community, and understand what that might mean for your investments. Try to get that top to bottom understanding of requirements. I think that's usually done in things like threat hunting and tabletop exercises. So do a threat hunt of, okay, 2016 Ukraine. If we actually experience that, what would it look like? Can we find if that type of a threat or behavior is already in our environment today? Let's go look and figure out that we don't actually have the prevention, detection, or response capabilities required to actually know. And get that, and then rehearse with it and make sure that that's that tabletop exercise. And then again, this is a big one. I think most of us in the security practitioner community understand this, but it is a board level topic that I think is getting defined now. And that is, the enterprise security teams are not resourced or capable of just adding on the entirety of the industrial mission, which is larger than the enterprise mission, although the number of systems might be smaller. And I think I often get quoted about this in the community. I want to verify and sort of set the record straight a little bit, It's not that I think you have to have an OT SOC in the sense that you need a giant room with a bunch of screens and a unique budget and chain of command. A SOC to me, a security operations center, is people, process, and technology. If you're going to have different types of systems with different missions and different threats, you're going to need different people, process, and technology and the approach to them. The training is going to be different. The ways that you measure and keep track of people is going to be different. In a SOC, you might track people on the number of tickets they closed. And in an operations technology focus, that may not matter at all. It may be the mean time to recovery that they're able to contribute to. It might be the relationships that are developing with your operators for when something actually happens. The technology, everyone sort of has this view, I think now in the security community, I'll say everybody, but quite a few teams I've run across have this view of, we'll just deploy DPAC inspection technologies in the ICS to understand the communications, and we'll throw everything into a SIEM, or maybe we'll just throw everything into QRadar or Splunk. Like, well, it's not about the data, it's about the content, the correlations, how we're using it. You are going to require unique technology and, of course, the process, how you're actually doing the governance and then understanding around all this, as well as how you're doing everything from tactical level escalation to board level communications. So things are going to be different in operation technology. Understanding where and how is important. And to me, it starts with the board. And at that board level definition, that's where you're going to have the most success. So, and if you hit the next slide. Perfect. At this point, here's the Dragos CEO interview. I think we might have the Deloitte one on the next slide. And then here's the Deloitte future survey. I think combining these two documents will give you a pretty good view on what is being thought about at the executive level, and then what are the types of questions the board is asking. And the combination of those two is going to put you in a really good spot to figuring out, balancing the answers that you're getting back at the executives, as well as figuring out where to put the investments and where the right level of security needs to be championed in your environment. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.